Welcome to Whisper of Vengeance, a place where quiet wrongs don't stay quiet forever. This is a story about patience, power, and the kind of revenge that doesn't scream, it whispers. I worked as a senior systems analyst at a private technology firm in Boston for nearly 15 years, starting in the late 90s and stretching into the early 2000s. I wasn't ambitious in the loud way. I didn't chase credit or recognition. I was dependable, invisible, and trusted, the kind of employee companies rely on but rarely reward. Then Richard Hale arrived. Richard was hired as a supervisor, though he never directly managed me. Still, he behaved as if everything in the office belonged to him. I'd return to my desk and notice papers slightly moved. Documents read. Copies missing. Later, my work would resurface through his team, changed just enough to hide its origin, then praised as innovation. Richard didn't steal loudly. He stole quietly. He loved attention, thrived on admiration, and took credit like it was his birthright. The office tolerated him, but no one respected him. And long before he realized it, Richard had already made an enemy, one who preferred silence over confrontation. Every year, one small reward kept me grounded in that job. A high-level industry conference in Honolulu. I attended it with my closest co-worker, Daniel, year after year. It wasn't just about learning, it was recognition. A quiet thank you for years of loyalty. The conference took place at a beachfront resort on Waikiki Beach. Rooms were limited. If you didn't reserve early, you stayed somewhere else. That was the unspoken rule everyone knew. One afternoon, while I was away, Richard noticed my travel authorization form sitting on my desk. A few days later, he announced confidently that he would also be attending the conference. There was only enough funding to send 2 people. Richard outranked us. Someone had to step aside. Daniel and I didn't argue. We flipped a coin. I won. Richard smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was possessive. Like the trip now belonged to him and I was just an accessory. From that moment on, he acted less like a colleague and more like a man who believed the world should rearrange itself around him. I traveled often for work and had accumulated a serious amount of frequent flyer miles. Because the flight from the East Coast to Honolulu crossed the required hours, we were authorized to fly business class, a rare privilege. Quietly, I upgraded myself to first class using my miles. I didn't mention it to Richard. Richard, meanwhile, mentioned everything to everyone else. He bragged about Hawaii. About the resort. About flying business class like it was proof of his importance. He soaked in the attention, repeating the story until it lost all meaning. Then he came to me. He didn't ask, he instructed. I was expected to introduce him to conference regulars. Take him to the best restaurants. Make sure he had a great time. Like I was his personal guide. That's when I understood something clearly. This wasn't about travel. It wasn't about work. It was about power. And for the first time in years, I felt something sharpen inside me. A calm resolve. A decision not to confront but to observe. To wait. And to let Richard's own arrogance walk him exactly where he deserved to go. The afternoon before departure, I called the airline to reconfirm my reservation. Years of travel had taught me that lesson. No business class seats available. No first class seats available. Only coach. I thanked the agent and hung up. Later that day, I found a payphone anonymous, disconnected from names and offices. Calmly, I adjusted Richard's reservation. His Sunday flight quietly became a Monday flight. Still business class. Just, later. Then I called the hotel. And cancelled his room. There was no adrenaline rush. No guilt. Just precision. For once, I was the one making changes quietly, invisibly, just like he always had. Sunday morning, I checked in without issue. I waited in the first-class lounge, sipping a drink, listening to boarding announcements echo through the terminal. When I reached the gate, first class was boarding. I took my seat. And that's when I saw Richard storming down the jetway, his face twisted with anger, already losing control of a situation he thought he owned. Richard froze when he saw me. His anger spilled out immediately, complaints about the airline, the system, anyone but himself. The flight attendant shut him down quickly and directed him to his seat. Coach. Middle seat. 5 seats across. Twice during the flight, he walked up to first class to complain. Once, he even asked if I'd switch seats with him for the remainder of the flight. I smiled politely and declined. At the hotel, the illusion finally shattered. The resort was sold out. Richard had no reservation. I watched him argue with the front desk, his voice rising, authority evaporating in public. 15 minutes later, my room phone rang. He wanted to share my room. I lied. 1 bed, I said. I didn't mention the second queen. The balcony. Or the ocean rolling calmly below. For the rest of the week, Richard walked back and forth from a cheap motel 10 minutes away, silent, diminished, forgotten. And I never said a word. That first night in Hawaii felt different. Not exciting. Not celebratory. Just quiet. I stood on my balcony, listening to the ocean roll in and out like it had done forever, indifferent to human ego. Somewhere out there, Richard was dragging his suitcase toward a cheap motel, reality settling in with every step. I didn't feel joy. I felt balance. The next morning, I walked into the conference refreshed. Familiar faces greeted me. Handshakes. Smiles. Conversations that picked up exactly where they'd left off a year ago. This was my space. Always had been. Richard arrived late. Slightly out of breath. Sweat still clinging to his collar. He scanned the room, searching for attention that never came. No one rushed to greet him. No one cared. For the first time since he joined the company, Richard wasn't the loudest presence in the room. And that silence followed him. Over the next few days, I noticed how much effort it took for Richard just to keep up. Walking back and forth from the motel under the Hawaiian sun drained him. He arrived late to sessions, left early, always distracted. The confidence he once wore so comfortably began to crack. During panels, he spoke less. When he did speak, his comments fell flat. People nodded politely, then turned away. The admiration he expected never arrived. I kept my distance. Not out of hatred but strategy. The less I engaged, the more invisible he became. And invisibility, I'd learned, was far more painful to men like him than confrontation. One evening, after the first day's sessions, I let him sit with us during the cocktail social. Out of pity. He barely spoke. Just sipped his drink and watched others laugh without him. For once, Richard wasn't stealing anything. Not attention. Not credit. Not space. Each night, as the sun dropped into the ocean, I watched Richard leave the resort alone. No group. No laughter. Just a tired man walking toward a place he didn't want to be. 10 minutes doesn't sound long. But when you're humiliated, every step stretches. I wondered if he thought about control during those walks. About desks he'd searched. Ideas he'd taken. Lines he'd crossed quietly, assuming no one would ever push back. I never followed him. Never checked on him. Revenge didn't require an audience. By midweek, he stopped trying. He attended sessions, nodded when necessary, and disappeared as soon as they ended. The man who once demanded attention now avoided it completely. And I realized something then. This wasn't cruelty. This was consequence. Saturday night came faster than expected. Bags packed. Conference over. The illusion dissolved. At the airport, Richard checked in early. He was back in business class for the return flight. This time, he didn't brag. Didn't complain. Didn't even look in my direction. On the plane, he stayed seated. Quiet. Contained. Like a man who finally understood the cost of entitlement. I sat in first class again, sipping a drink, watching the cabin lights dim. No words passed between us. None were needed. Some lessons don't need explanations. They just need to be felt. As the plane lifted into the night sky, I felt something close to peace. Not satisfaction. Not pride. Closure. A few days after we returned, I met Daniel for lunch. Same place as always. Same table. He asked how the trip had been. I told him everything. The flight change. The hotel cancellation. The quiet unraveling. Daniel laughed not loudly, but genuinely. Said it almost made up for not being able to travel with me that year. Richard never confronted me. Never accused me. Maybe he suspected. Maybe he didn't. It didn't matter. I never raised my voice. Never demanded respect. Never asked for credit. I simply allowed a man to experience what it feels like when someone rearranges your world without permission. This is Whisper of Vengeance. Sometimes revenge doesn't roar. Sometimes it walks quietly beside you and lets karma do the talking. Weeks passed after the conference, yet I kept thinking about Richard. Not with anger. Not with satisfaction. Just observation. He returned to the office like nothing had changed. But I knew better. The arrogance that once defined him had cracked quietly, irreversibly. I went back to my normal routine: meetings, reports, and silent nights at my desk. Nothing special. Nothing loud. Everything smooth. Yet, every time I passed Richard in the hallway, there was a subtle shift. A glance that lingered too long. A hesitation in his step. It was small. Invisible to everyone else. But it was there. This was the essence of quiet revenge. Not confrontation. Not public humiliation. Just letting the consequences unfold naturally. Watching someone who thought they were untouchable realize that the world doesn't always bend to arrogance. And I realized then that patience was as satisfying as triumph. That some lessons stick far better when delivered silently, without theatrics, without explanation. I spent hours thinking about control, the illusion of it, the grip we believe we have over others. Richard had assumed control over everything around him: my work, my ideas, my achievements. He thought it was his by default. Yet, control is fragile. It can vanish in an instant, often through the smallest actions, the quietest decisions. The flight, the hotel, the rooms, the coins of fate flipped. They were not acts of malice. They were acts of balance. Acts of restoring something that was quietly taken from me over the years. I never gloated. I never sought revenge with force. The satisfaction came from observing. From knowing that someone who underestimated patience, discretion, and foresight had experienced the consequences of their arrogance firsthand. It was poetic, subtle, and deeply personal, a whisper of vengeance, just like the name of this channel. Some colleagues would never understand. They would say, "Why not confront him, or why not speak up?" They misunderstand the power of silence. Sometimes, silence carries more weight than any argument. Sometimes, allowing someone to stumble into the results of their own arrogance teaches lessons that words cannot. Richard learned humility without me ever raising my voice. He learned patience by being denied what he expected. He learned discomfort without me ever inflicting pain directly. I watched. He adjusted. Slowly, subtly. Every step, every glance, every awkward encounter reinforced what I had known for years, that quiet actions can carry consequences louder than screams. And in that, I found a strange sense of satisfaction. Not cruelty, not anger. Just balance restored. Justice whispered. Years later, I still think about Richard. Not with rage. Not with triumph. Just reflection. In a world full of loud declarations, of egos and arrogance, quiet patience remains underestimated. Many never realize that actions speak louder than words, that the smallest decision can change someone's world entirely. What I did wasn't about malice. It was about experience. About letting a man discover what he had been blind to for years, that taking credit for others comes at a cost. That stealth and arrogance eventually collide with reality. And the most satisfying part? He never saw it coming. Never confronted me. Never recovered fully from that subtle lesson. That's the beauty of quiet vengeance. Subtle, deliberate, and lasting. This is why I share these stories on Whisper of Vengeance. Not to brag. Not to boast. But to remind you that sometimes the most powerful responses aren't loud. Sometimes, they're calculated, patient, and almost invisible like a whisper. Richard didn't learn because I shouted. He learned because I let reality unfold around him, because I allowed balance to return naturally. And sometimes, in a world full of noise, that quiet satisfaction is stronger than any scream. Remember this, revenge doesn't need to be dramatic. It doesn't need to be public. It doesn't need witnesses. It only needs timing, patience, and a whisper. The world listens, even when no one else does.